speaker for today, but I think a lot of you have read his articles and know a lot about him. Bud is a homegrown Fort Worth guy who started out covering high school football here when he was 16 years old. He then worked for the Fort Worth Press and newspapers in Austin and Dallas. He came home in 1981, and since 1987, he's written more than 1,000 weekly dining columns and more than 3,000 news and political columns. If you don't like what he says about politics, then read about his barbecue.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so I have 3 mics, I guess. So are they all working? Is everything working the way it's supposed to be working? I have a thumbs up back there. Okay. Well, I'm very flattered to be here. I can't believe I'm sitting in front of some of the historians and some of the scholars who've done so much work in this community that I rely on constantly. And some of you have done all the research that makes what I do possible. Usually my research consists of a couple of quick news bank searches and maybe a rushed flip through some of our old clippings or something like that. And usually when I do research, I have about an hour and a half to find whatever I need to find and get it done and get it in the paper. They asked me to bring you some notes about all the Fort Worth restaurants of yore. My research into dining in Fort Worth has been very extensive, as you can tell by looking. No, I've grown up here and lived here, and for the past 30 years I've been writing about food in Fort Worth and have lived some of the restaurants before that. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to write about the last few years of the restaurant industry and dining in Fort Worth, what I found out first, growing up as a journalist and coming to food writing from the journalist side and not from the cooking side, I found out how little real research there was in a lot of food journalism and food writing. Most of the food writing and most of the stories are legends that are handed down, and like when you go to a Tex-Mex restaurant and they'll have some made-up story on the menu that says, Uncle Julio was a man who lived all alone and came to the United States with his mules in 1911 or something like this. And we know Uncle Julio started in the mid-'80s, and it was started by executives who used to work for Papado, but they make up a story. And a lot of the lore is just handed down. Some of it's legend, some of it's just purely made up. And all the great stories about food, the story about nachos and the invention of nachos, that supposedly Ignacio was working in the hotel in Del Rio or in Acuna, and Pancho Villa's raiders were coming and they didn't have any food left except for some tortillas and cheese, and so he fried up the tortillas and shredded cheese on it. It made the first Ignacio's chips became nachos. And so, but a lot of these stories are handed down, and they're things that, there was never really any, historical research or work that went into a lot of these stories. Look at all the stories about the origin of the hamburger. Most of my life, the people of Athens, Texas, claim they invented the hamburger. Well, the reason they were able to do that is because the guy in Athens who claimed he invented the hamburger was good friends with the Murchisons in Dallas, and they had the money to promote the idea that Athens invented the hamburger. There are restaurants in New York and elsewhere in the United States that were serving hamburgers 20 years before anyone in Athens, Texas, but they got away with it. Even McDonald's taught that Athens created the hamburger. And to this day, we're not sure who first called the dish a chicken fried steak. There are people out in La Mesa, Texas, who swear that chicken fried steak was invented in La Mesa. But we have these little historical tools now, newspaper database archives, searchable newspapers, and so we can find things that we could never find before. And I can tell you that the first reference actually using the term chicken fried steak, although there are other references to fried steak, the first references to chicken fried steak were in Colorado in the teens, and then in the Midwest and in Illinois in the 20s. And then it wasn't until the 30s or 40s that they started writing about chicken fried steak in Texas. The onset of the searchable databases has been a great help for us in writing about food and in writing about restaurants. basically it's deflated a lot of myths. It has helped us eliminate a lot of baloney that had been written and rewritten many times over the years and retold as if it were true. Now, having said that, there are some things that even the databases don't help us with. You know, there are some families that are not quite sure when their family started the restaurant. They just know it's been handed down for years. There are some buildings where the family's history doesn't jive with the tax history or the physical history of the building. And I'm going to tell you right now that I'm not quite sure, as I stand here, which is the oldest restaurant in Fort Worth. But by the time I'm done, I'll talk about a lot of different restaurants, and maybe you can help me decide which one you think we should call the oldest. Now, I'm really grateful to some people in all the historical work. I showed Rob Walsh and Daniel Vaughn, two of the best food writers in Texas, how to use Genealogy Bank and Newspaper Archive. And they have come back with a lot of the best work on the history of food. Rob's done a book on the history of Tex-Mex where he traces back the Chili Queens in San Antonio. And Rob has a restaurant in Houston. One of the restaurants he honors at that restaurant in Houston is the original Mexican restaurant in Fort Worth. One of his dishes is the Roosevelt platter, which is a platter from the original here. But you know, he honors the original here, but he's also written about the history going back to the 19th century of the Chili Queens and the tamal makers you know, I'm actually on the Smithsonian blog for this. My little contribution to all this history detective work is that the Fritos Company for years has promoted this whole history of how the Doolin family developed Fritos and brought Fritos to the market, and but they've just always had this little one-sentence line in there that said that Elmer Doolin bought the method for making Fritos from a immigrant in San Antonio who was selling to a few local restaurants, and they leave it at that, and they don't tell the story beyond that. Well, I'd found some older stories about Fritos that explain that actually there was one story that gave a name. Well, by searching the San Antonio Express online, I was able to find that man not only sold corn chips, he was a soccer coach, and he sold the corn chip business and went back to Mexico. And I actually found, searching the San Antonio Express, a classified ad that was corn chip business for sale, active route, contact, and it gave an address. Well, when the San Antonio Library crisscrossed the address, it came back to the home of the soccer coach. So I found the classified ad where the true founder of Fritos, who came from Mexico and deserves the credit, sold the business to the Doolins. So that's part of my mission in some of this, is to make sure the real founders get the credit. But anyway, Rob has taken a lot of the databases and done great work on the history of Tex-Mex. Daniel Vaughn, how many of you read the Barbecue Snob in Texas Monthly? Texas Monthly magazine has a barbecue editor now, an all-time great job. And Daniel is not just a historian, he writes about the culture, or not just a food critic, he writes about the history and culture of barbecue. And his mission that he's still on is to find out where barbecue became brisket. You know, if you look at the old databases, barbecue is a term for a dinner. Everybody's having a barbecue or throwing a barbecue, and very rarely do you find details about the type of food. And when you do, the meat that's barbecued is either the whole hog, or if it's beef, it's the beef shoulder. And so, at some point in the 40s or 50s, Texas restaurants stopped serving shoulder as barbecue and started serving brisket. Well, what Daniel actually found was that the oldest reference online that we can find to any place serving barbecued brisket is at a place in Fort Worth named Sawyer's Grocery. It's on South Main, just south of Vickery. It's the building where the Wendy Davis headquarters is now. They're on the left-hand side of Main, just as you go out. Now, Mr. Sawyer had in his ads that he had barbecued brisket, and this is in the teens. This is 20 years before we can find any other advertising reference to barbecued brisket. But in reading about Mr. Sawyer and his grocery store, we found that one of his regular customers was a woman in the neighborhood who baked bread and used the brisket to make sandwiches. Her name was Nenny Baird. Mrs. Baird bought brisket from, it's almost a tongue twister. Mrs. Baird bought brisket from Sawyer and sold barbecued brisket sandwiches. And, you know, we don't know, but we think the first place brisket sandwiches might have been sold was here in Fort Worth. We have some other places in history. Of course, the most famous place Fort Worth has in food history is the location of the first restaurant that dared to put on the menu calf fries. Now, cowboys always ate calf fries because cowboys ate just about every part of the calf that they could down on the trail, and they actually considered them a little bit of a delicacy. But you know, all the cowboys in the stockyards thought they were good, and so Mr. Theo Yordanoff, who owned Theo's Saddle and Sirloin in the stockyards, which is now Risky's Sirloin Inn, went up to the packing houses, went up to the Swift and Armor plant, and he said, you know, the cowboys eat those, well, you all know what they are, right? Yeah. Mountain oysters, you know, they have various names. And so he went to the packing house. He said, you know, the cowboys eat those. You all don't sell those. You know, why don't you make me a deal on those? And the armor plant told him, they said, you can have as many of those as you want. Come, we give them away. And so he took all the testicles from the cattle and started battering them and frying them and selling them in his restaurant as calf fries. And that was the first restaurant that ever dared to put calf fries on the menu. Theo Yordanoff might have run, if you count the history of their various locations and blend it into the Risky Sirloin Inn history, maybe that's the oldest restaurant in Fort Worth. There's a lot of different ways to look at it depending whether you count different locations and gaps in operation and so forth. But Mr. Yordanoff came from Skopje, Macedonia, Yugoslavia, and came here. You know, part of Fort Worth's history is the great immigrant families who've come here and opened restaurants. And you know, Theo's is one of those. Theo's came from Macedonia, and you know, all the stockyards, as you all know, brought all kinds of cultures. Brought Germans, brought Eastern Europeans, you know, brought Russians, brought people from Mexico. You know, people from all over the world came to work in the stockyards. And so the people brought all kinds of food cultures to the north side and also embraced the cultures of beef and left their own mark on beef and on cooking in Fort Worth. Now, I'll back up a little bit before talking about the stockyards. I did try to look up some of the history of Fort Worth restaurants. I could find that probably a couple of the best known restaurants in the early century in Fort Worth. The first Hotel and Restaurant Association president was E.W. Mason of Dunn and Mason. I think that was a hotel and restaurant, said it opened in 1904 at 9th and Main. But when the Restaurant Association was founded in 1906, Mr. Mason was the president of it. And I found a lot of references to people dining at Dunn and Mason or having dinner at Dunn and Mason. But even before that, in the early 1900s, there were ads in the Star-Telegram for the very first one that I found had no name other than just Mexican restaurant. And of course, we know that there were tamale vendors on the streets in Fort Worth, but in, I think, 1903, there was an ad that just said Mexican restaurant, and then the line under it said, go and have a hot time. 111 East 10th Street, and the menu included enchiladas, tamales, frijoles, chili con carne, and it said rice soup, which I'm not sure exactly what that would have been. Well, there was a Mexican restaurant before there was the original. Well, Dunn and Mason seemed to dominate the early 1900s and into the teens, and then Joseph's Cafe opened. Those of you who follow picture postcards, who have seen a lot of the downtown pictures, you'll probably have seen pictures of Joseph's Cafe. Sam Joseph immigrated from, he was born in Latvia. He came and opened restaurants in Dallas and Fort Worth. His wife, Minnie, was German, and so Joseph and Minnie specialized in this pub kind of atmosphere. Have some of you been to Shiloh's in San Antonio, the root beer? Yeah, the atmosphere at Joseph's was very similar to Shiloh's if you look at the pictures. You know, wood paneled pub atmosphere, pub food, but very much a restaurant where everybody went. You know, the restaurants in the 19th century were pubs and bars and only men went, but Joseph's was probably the first prominent, busy restaurant, the Paris coffee shop of its day, where men and women both went in Fort Worth. They specialized in German pot roast and German fried potatoes, many recipes. But then, during World War I, it wasn't as popular to serve anything called German pot roast or German fried potatoes, particularly not in a city with Camp Bowie. So, y'all remember lately when we changed French fries to freedom fries? Back in World War I, the Josephs changed German and pot roast and fried potatoes to American pot roast and American fried potatoes. Now, there was also a restaurant back then on Lower Houston just called the French Restaurant, owned by a man named Jetton. I don't know any more about that, but I can tell you that we had a French restaurant in the early part of the century. I talked about the immigrant families and everything they brought to Fort Worth, and one of the things we thought that they brought was the oldest restaurant. For years we thought the Paris coffee shop was the oldest restaurant. Vic Paris opened it in 1926. He sold it right away to the Asikas family, some of the Greek immigrants in Fort Worth. Greek immigrants have dominated plate lunch cafes all over Texas. The S&S in San Antonio, Houston, the family, the Lucas B&B in Dallas. Greek immigrants dominated the plate lunch business in much of Texas and became the specialists. Here we still have, besides the Paris coffee shop, we have Nick Keith's Jazz Cafe, and these restaurants that have been handed down from 100 years of restaurant business. Let's see, the Asikas, opened at 1 block east on Magnolia from where it is now. And we always thought the Paris was the, and by the way, if you know the Paris and you think, well, his name is Smith, Mike changed the name. Actually, his dad, Greg Smith, changed the family name from Asikas to Smith because of the American distrust of foreigners in the 20s, in the time of the Klan, in the time of backlash here. It was particularly strong because backlash both to immigrants and to the strong influx of immigrants here to work in the stockyards. So the Asikas changed their name back then to Smith. So Mike Smith now runs the Paris coffee shop, but it's inherited from the Asikases in 1926. Now, we thought for years that the Paris was the oldest. And I always argued with Butch Self, who owns the original, about exactly when the original opened. I think that if you go out to the original right now, I think that Butch's T-shirts and caps say since 1930. I saw ads in the rodeo programs in the 60s and 70s that said the original Mexican restaurant since 1936. So I've always argued with Butch. And then along came the great work of Dr. Cuellar. And Dr. Cuellar's book, Stories from the Barrio, A History of Mexican Fort Worth, one of the best, most essential Fort Worth history books ever. He profiles the restaurant families. He profiles the Joe T. Garcia's families, the Polito families, and he profiled the Pinedas. And it turns out that the original opened in 1926. Francisco Pinedo was from Spain. His wife was born in Laredo and descended from a family from Musquis, and they had lived in San Antonio and eventually moved to Fort Worth. Now, here again we get into date problems. Dr. Cuellar says that the Pinedas opened the original in 1926, but I believe the utility connection records and the building records show that that building was built in 1927. So, either way, and now we get back into, okay, the Paris opened in 26, the original opened in 26 or 27, who was first? So now, we continue to get into this wonderful little back and forth over who's the oldest. Then we bring back in Theo Yordanoff in the stockyards. Theo came from Skopje as a teenager, and that was in 1920 when the packing houses were booming. And the descriptions in the clippings about Theo's Saddle and Sirloin in the 50s and 60s just say that it opened in the 20s and that Mr. Yordanoff and his daughters were very proud of serving steaks with kapusta, which was the cabbage soup that he'd grown up with. And in Janelle Pate's book, North of the River, again, she has another take on it. She wrote that Theo's Cafe didn't start at that location, that his first cafe was on Northeast 23rd, pretty close to where Joe T. Garcia's eventually opened up, and that he opened that in 1920. Well, so if you say Theo opened that in 1920, then he moved over to where Risky's Sirloin is now in the stockyards. But you know, that steakhouse, that was closed for like 10 years between Theo and the Risky's. You know, do we count that as the oldest restaurant in Fort Worth? It didn't stay in that location. It doesn't have the same owner, but you know, is there some descendancy? But I've made notes about the Theo selling the calf fries. The cowboy came in one day and asking for calf fries and asked for it this way. He said, "They're what separates the bulls from the cows." So Theo started selling the calf fries, and the first sandwich was 15 cents. So, and that's our one little national. Oh, by the way, if a customer asked what they were, Theo would just smile and say, "They're fresh from the tree." So, and by the way, when you go to that restaurant now, it has all this schlocky Western interior, and that was redone in 1955 by the Walt Disney Studios, who came in and installed all this Western decor. This was in a response to the Jesse Roach and Cattleman's effort and the Fort Worth effort to build a Western village in the stockyards area. I think most of you in here probably know that the look of the stockyards with the wooden sidewalks and the wooden awnings is a 1950s business promotion creation that Jesse Roach and, well actually, you know, I should talk about Jesse Roach. Jesse Roach was in the insurance business. And he had this insurance agency on North Main just past Exchange upstairs, and there was some retail space downstairs, and he leased it out to someone else who said, "Okay, I'm going to open a place, I'm going to call it Cattleman's Cafe right here in the stockyards." Well, within about 6 months, Cattleman's Cafe folded, and Mr. Roach couldn't find anybody else to run it. So he said, "Well, I'll just see if I can run it myself." He said, "People seem to like steaks. I'll try to run Cattleman's myself." So he brought in more steaks and made it Cattleman's Steakhouse. And then as Cattleman's Steakhouse grew in popularity, it was Mr. Roach who chaired the whole idea in the 40s and 50s of turning the stockyards into a Western village. And this is, remember, when the packing houses were still thriving and it smelled out there. I mean, if it didn't smell like feedlot, it smelled like, you know, derelict, you know, some of the problems out that the stockyards had. But he foresaw this tourist attraction of a Western village and started building it. So the whole idea of bringing tourists to the stockyards and building a Western village started with Cattleman's. Now, I don't claim that Joe T's is the oldest, but I can tell you that Joe T's is one of the oldest Tex-Mex restaurants in Texas. Joe T's opened in 1935 on the 4th of July, but it didn't open as a Tex-Mex restaurant. Joe Garcia came to Fort Worth after or during the Revolution, another one of the families who came to flee Pancho Villa. He came here and got a job working in the packing houses. He and Jesusita, his wife, both came from Michoacan, from the towns of La Piedad and Yurecro. And Joe worked in the packing houses, but he thought about trying to open a little business on the side. And so when a Greek immigrant grocery store in a little one-room shack at Commerce and 23rd went out of business, there was a little Greek immigrant store there that had been there about 2 years and closed down. And Joe Garcia said, "You know, I think I'll buy that and I'll open me up a little barbecue place." And so when you go to Joe T's today, there is still a pit between the dining room and the kitchen, in with those inside bathrooms there where you used to walk through years ago from the kitchen to the dining room. There's still a barbecue pit there. Well, when Joe T's opened on the 4th of July in 1935, it was Joe Garcia Barbecue and Chili. And Joe opened with barbecue and chili because he knew that's what he could make and he knew that's what he could sell. Now, he was doing a great business at barbecue, but one day he came down sick. And Jesusita couldn't really work the pit or put in the barbecue. And so all these customers came who came for Joe's barbecue. And Jesusita, they called her Mama Sus. You know, Jesusita said, "You know, I'm sorry Joe's sick." She said, "All I made some tamales and I've got some quesadillas here, and she made these little quesadillas with corn tortillas. They were corn tortillas pressed together with cheese in the middle, and it was like, if you go out there today and you get those big round nachos that they have, is basically like a stack of those, like having one turned upside down on top of the other one. But they were her quesadillas. And so all she had were tamales and quesadillas, and people loved it. People said, this is great. And so she served that for a couple of days, and then Joe came back. And Joe said, okay, I'm back. Everybody's back from my barbecue. And then people started coming in and say, when's she going to make those tamales again? And then, he said, well, okay, so, but Joe continued to make his barbecue. And chili in particular, he was really proud of his chili recipe. And I should mention, too, that Fort Worth is not the first place where chili was served. That's San Antonio. But the first packaged chili con carne was sold here by the Penderies, the first retail chili con carne package. So we have a chili history here. And the packing house workers all loved to compete to see who could make the best chili con carne, who had the best chili recipe. Joe was very proud of his. So Joe came back. He continued to make his barbecue and chili. She started making more tamales and quesadillas. And actually there is an old menu. I'm sorry, I don't know how to do a PowerPoint. I would have made all this a PowerPoint. But I put every old picture I can find on the Facebook page, the Eats Beat Facebook page. And there is an old menu that the Joe T's people have that shows all the barbecue plates along with the combination plates. And their phone book listing, until a few years ago, their phone was also listed as Joe T Barbecue. North Commerce. So the barbecue continued up until Joe died. Joe died in 1953. And so they were doing barbecue and Tex-Mex from 35 to 53, and the Mexican food was what grew more and more popular. And the setting and the family, and people came to see the daughters. Hope Garcia married Paul Lancart, and people came to see Hope and Mary, and everybody loved the girls and the friendliness and the whole atmosphere of that little one-room restaurant. And so people kept coming and coming and coming. And then, of course, after Joe died, Mama Jesusita continued to be the matriarch of the family, but Hope and Paul Lancart, as you know, took it over and ran it. And Paul Lancart's business since really helped it expand. In 1970, they built the pool, and it became the Fiesta Gardens and the patio that we know today. And that lifted Joe T's into another level of legend for Tex-Mex restaurants. When Foodways Texas, you all should take a look at the Foodways Texas website. It's out of the School of American Studies at UT. But when they selected the 5 restaurants to profile to start with for their oral history series on Texas iconic restaurants, Joe T's was one of the 5 they chose. And they did a long interview with the Lancarts. I'm sad that Hope wasn't feeling well enough to be part of it. I've sat for hours and talked with Hope, about her family and about the history and about the day the restaurant opened. And it's just a great opportunity. But the Foodways Texas has done a great job of paying tribute to Joe T. Some of the other restaurants here, when you talk about Fort Worth's iconic restaurants, well, and I should say, when I started writing about restaurants, I never claimed to know anything about food. And so I decided I want to go see what the experts think are the best restaurants in Fort Worth. Well, at the time in Gourmet Magazine, there was a kind of the diners, drive-ins column of its time was called Road Food. And it was Jane and Michael Stern wrote a column in Gourmet about the little iconic restaurants all over America. And this was the only source back then for news about small, friendly local restaurants. Everybody was busy writing about the great continental restaurants and the great fine dining restaurants. But Gourmet had this wonderful column, and if they, in Boston they would tell you where to find the best chowder. In Maine they'd tell you where to find the best lobster. In New Orleans they'd show you the gumbo. In Chicago they'd tell you about some great grill to get a Maxwell dog. And so I thought, well, now these people really know something about local food and Texas food, and these people have chronicled American food all over the country. Let's see what they like in Fort Worth. So I flipped open the book, and I was amazed to see that they'd been to Fort Worth, had read about some restaurants. And then I started flipping through the list, and they wrote about a lot of restaurants in the East. They wrote about restaurants in Boston and New York and all up and down the East Coast, but let's say west of the Mississippi, when they start looking at really definitive restaurants, restaurants that were just emblematic of local and regional cuisine, really definitive, iconic local restaurants. The city with the most restaurants that defined the region that really were unique was San Francisco. A lot of great restaurants in San Francisco, a lot of great dining. The city in the West with the next most restaurants that that stood out as defining the area as unique and local was Santa Fe. Everybody talks about red and green chili and Woolworth's on the Square and Tomasitas and all the great restaurants in Santa Fe. Well, the restaurant in the West that had the third most restaurants that were definitive and so important enough to be included in this national book of unique and local restaurants was Fort Worth. I think that's pretty good company to be after San Francisco and Santa Fe for unique and local dining. And so I said, wow, look at this. And they listed 6 restaurants in Fort Worth. They listed Cattleman's, they listed Joe T's, they listed the Paris Coffee Shop, they listed Angelo's, Angelo George's family's barbecue place on White Settlement that opened in, I want to say, 1958. He opened on St. Patrick's Day. He didn't have any barbecue ready. He just had beer and hard-boiled eggs, and he went ahead and got open and said, "Come back in a few days and have barbecue." So they listed those. They listed those 4 restaurants. They listed Massey's Chicken Fried Steaks and Kincaid's Hamburger. So, and those were kind of the main 6 in Fort Worth in the 70s and 80s, I think. Massey's is no longer with us and has been gone in its original form since 1996. Massey's opened in 1947. Herb Massey Charles Massey had a falling out with, well, now I'm getting the Massey brothers mixed up. The Massey brothers had a falling out. One had Massey's Club 21 on the Jacksboro Highway, and it was Herb Massey's dinner place. But then they wound up, and there was also a Herb Massey's Subway Cafe downtown in the building, I believe, where Bird Cafe is now. But that wound up being Charles Massey's restaurant. And in the 1980s, Massey's sold an average of 6,000 chicken fried steaks a week. It became the definitive Fort Worth chicken fried steak, and everybody coming to a TCU game had to go to Massey's. I remember once when I started at the Star-Telegram, I came back and I worked in sports, and we were getting all worried about, Dutch Meyer's going downhill. We need to get an obituary ready on Dutch Meyer. And we worked really hard getting a story together about Dutch Meyer. And I went, oh my gosh, let's get the pictures, get everything ready, put it in the file. And the next night I saw Dutch Meyer eating a chicken fried steak at Massey's. And I thought, well, maybe Dutch is doing okay after all. So, but the Massey's were very proud of choosing a fine sirloin and battering it in egg wash twice. And they had a special recipe that they were loyal to. The other restaurant that was in the book was Kincaid's. Kincaid's opened as a grocery store in September 1940. That light is getting dim. September 1946. Charles Kincaid and Roy Pope used to work together. Charles Kincaid split off and opened his own grocery store. And then in 1947, he hired a butcher named O.R. Gentry. Every grocery store had to have a good butcher. Well, along about 1964, the family now thinks they've narrowed it down. They have just said in the early 60s for a long time. Mr. Gentry started using the cuts and ends of meat and grinding them up and grilling hamburgers. And he just made a few hamburgers and sold them at lunch to students who would come by from Arlington Heights High School. And people liked his burgers because they were made fresh and hand-packed, so he started cooking some more burgers. And eventually Charles Kincaid retired, and O.R. Gentry bought the grocery store in 1967. So he'd been cooking his burgers, and it was really his grocery store then, and the Gentry family, carried on with the burgers. And then eventually, as you all know, the grocery store became less of a grocery store and more of a burger grill. And the Kincaid's Hamburgers were one of the first Fort Worth restaurants nationally recognized. They were on the cover of Life, not on the cover, but inside Life magazine in the early 1970s. there was an article about the best hamburgers in the USA. And there were two places at the top, Castle's in Los Angeles and Kincaid's Hamburgers in Fort Worth. And after that, Kincaid's took off and became the great Texas hamburger restaurant. And when Texas Monthly Magazine started in 1973 and did their first cover piece on the best hamburgers in Texas, Kincaid's was held up as the one to measure as the definitive Texas hamburger. So that's and as you all know, since then Kincaid's has grown and flourished. And so anyway, the important thing about Kincaid's hamburger is it really wasn't Charles Kincaid's hamburger, it was O.R. Gentry's hamburger. I talked about the conflict over who was first or who came first. Depending how you figure Theo's, depending who came first, the original or the Paris coffee shop. We have a late entry, and I think that this is the one I'm now recognizing as probably the oldest continuously operating restaurant, is Carson's. Carson's, the family always has given 1928 or 1930 as their starting date. But Hollis Weiner, in her research on Jewish Texans and Jewish families, found that David Carson, who was born in Estonia and came to Fort Worth in 1905, that Dave Carson and the Tchaikovsky family opened up a sandwich shop in 1926 at 11th and Throckmorton. 1925. This is 1 year before the Paris and the original. And in 1925, Dave Carson and the Tchaikovskys opened. At 11th and Throckmorton, he operated a cafe and sandwich shop there and moved in 1934, split off from the Tchaikovskys and moved to 1010 Houston in 1934, and then later to Westbury, to his old location and to where the family is now. So Carson's dates, I think, continuously back to 1925 in 4 different locations. And I think that when people ask what's the oldest restaurant in town, I usually now say Carson's. I think Carson's and Dave Carson's Sandwich Shop may be the oldest. There are a couple of other ones to talk about. Mexican Inn in 1936. And then let's see, I talked about our place in history, Calf Fries. The first drive-ins in America were the pig stand restaurants. The original motor dining was the pig stand. The first pig stand was on what's now West Davis, on the edge of Chalk Hill on the west side of Dallas. But I believe the second pig stand it wasn't the North Main location in Fort Worth. I think the second pig stand was another one of the Fort Worth locations. I think I skipped over something about early day restaurants. The Star Cafe, some people ask about that, and some people call the Star Cafe the oldest restaurant. The current Star Cafe opened in 1980. It had been a Black Eyed Pea before that. But there was a Star Cafe in the Stockyards in the early part of the 20th century in the building that's now Letty's. It moved across Exchange and up the street and operated mostly as a bar, but some of it as a cafe into the 20s and 30s. But there was a gap there in the Stockyards where there was no Star Cafe. Gosh, y'all, I know there's some old restaurants I've left out, and I know y'all might want to ask about some different restaurants. I'll be glad to answer questions about Fort Worth and food and history, and I thank all of you for all the great work you've done that I have piggybacked on to try and build some of this history of all the restaurants. So, any questions? Any comments in the back? Yes.
Did you stumble on anything about 2 places I remember from my young years? One was Mrs. Simpson's dining room, which was 1 block west of this building, and the other was the Big Apple over on off 28th Street, which was barbecue.
I know very little about Mrs. Simpson's dining room. I've heard about it, and I've heard glorious things about it. And I see reference to it. I don't know anything about Mrs. Simpson or how that came about. I can tell you that the Big Apple is still revered, and the Big Apple sauce is still something that is a popular, talked about sauce recipe. The Big Apple was on. Is it Angle at 28th? Is that called Cliff or Angle there?
Listed on 28th, but it's like half a block.
Half a block off 28th. And the Big Apple was a Stockyards area barbecue place. And I don't remember the name of the operator, but I can tell you that the cook there was Pappy Williams. Pappy Williams was the pitmaster and cook. And into the 80s, Pappy Williams had a barbecue trailer over in Stop 6. And the barbecue and the sauce were straight from the Big Apple and into the 80s. And then, you know, he passed away. The recipe for the sauce was carried on by Terry Brown, and he served it with his barbecue at Terry's Grill. Many of you remember Terry's Grill on Houston downtown, until Terry closed that in, I think he made it past 2000 with that before he closed Terry's Grill. But the red apple sauce and the history of the red apple is still much talked about, the Big Apple. Did you know any more about it?
No.
Yeah.
Mrs. Simpson's was a boarding house, but they served family-style lunches and dinners. I don't know more about dinners, but I remember it was late 40s or early 50s.
Yeah, Pappy Williams' history with the Big Apple. What?
They call it Jenny Simpson.
Jenny Simpson? I'll need to look that one up because that's come up a couple of times. I know Pappy Williams is regarded as one of the first African-American pit masters, and then of course Drake's Cafeteria, which operated on Rosedale until just about 15 years ago. You know, the Drake family started that in the Black Wall Street district down on Lower 9th in the 20s, and so Drake's Cafeteria was very old too. Someone else had their hand up?
Yeah,
Yes.
Massey's Cafe. What was the reason why they shut down? Was it because of lack of business, or?
Massey's originally, in 1996, Charles Massey died, and Doris didn't want to run it by herself, and so she leased it out to two guys who were partners in the Arlington Steakhouse in Arlington. And they made it a little bit more like the Arlington Steakhouse. They kept the recipe. There was one fellow there who'd worked there for 40 years. They kept him for a long time. But eventually they closed it, and a lot of the reason they closed it because there are 90 restaurants now that sell 6,000 chicken fried steaks a week. The appetite for chicken fried steak and the concern about beef, fat, and salt has grown to the point we are standing in the last outpost of steak in America. The Outback Steaks chain told me a couple of years ago that Tarrant County, Texas, is the last place where they sell more steak than chicken or fish in their restaurants. We're standing in the last outpost of steak eaters. And so, you know, Massey's didn't keep up with the times, and the people's tastes changed. And then Massey's recently closed in its latest version. I think the property's been sold and probably to a medical group. I don't know exactly what will come of that location. When people say, where do you go now for chicken fried steak? For something that's like Massey's was, I think the Star Cafe and Ginger Brown's are the two I send them to. Ginger Brown's is on the Jacksboro Highway. And then for a good chicken fried steak, I think, you know, they have I tell people we have artisan chicken fried steak now. We have $15 chicken fried steak at Lucille's or Riata, and then I think the Oak Acres Barbecue, Billy's Oak Acres out on North Las Vegas Trail, where the old Hip Pocket used to be, has a very good chicken fried steak on Thursdays and Sundays. So I see I can throw in food tips along with history tips here. Someone else, yes?
Where was Massey's when it closed?
Massey's was always at 8th Avenue, on 8th Avenue, 1 block south of Park Place. And it opened there, and I've forgotten the name, it opened there as a drive-in by another man's name. And then the Massey's took it over. And what you all should know about Massey's is that Massey's is with us forever, because in the movie Baja, Oklahoma, written in the book Baja, Oklahoma, written by Dan Jenkins, Massey's is portrayed as Herb's Cafe. And so it's Herb's Cafe in the book and movie. Everything that goes on at Herb's went on at Massey's. And even the cafe even has a neon sign that's very reminiscent of the old Massey's neon sign. And so it's used in the book Baja, Oklahoma. Yes.
I don't know if you know anything about when I was a child. This would have been the late 70s, maybe as far as the very beginning of the 80s. A restaurant on the corner of southeast corner of I-35 and Seminary called the Riviera.
Riviera, I remember there was a Riviera. I don't remember anything else about it.
I just remember it was, as a child, to me, it was open really late.
Mm-hmm.
It probably would go more than 10 or 11 o'clock.
No, I think the Riviera was part of the diner era. It was like Clover Drive-Ins or Lone Star Drive-Ins. I think the Riviera had kind of had come out of that, and it had moved into more of a sit-down restaurant type. But I think it was still from that, the 50s roadside car culture brought so many great restaurant, brought us so many great traditions that carry on now in restaurant culture. I think the Riviera came out of that.
For chicken fried steak, I can't help but think that H3 out in the
H3 is very popular. See, H3 and Lucille's are the same.
Oh, they are.
H3 and Lucille's are the same company, the same owners, and many of the same recipes. And H3 and Lucille's are. But yeah, H3 Ranch on Exchange in Maine. And Lucille's has its own little place because Lucille's, people who grew up here remember it as Finley's Cafeteria, the little wedge-shaped building there on North Main. Before that, it was called Steve's Cafe. The Murrin family owned it. It's in Juliet's great Camp Bowie book. And then, but it was also, for a little bit of time, it was a Black Eyed Pea. So both the Star Cafe and Lucille's used to be Black Eyed Pea locations when Jean Street was starting that.
My wife's family went, every Sunday after church, they went to Finley's Cafeteria.
Right.
For lunch, and my wife just loved it. Of course, she was little then, and she looked forward to that all week.
Finley's had great cream pies, and I could probably do another whole session about the Fort Worth bakery culture and all the various German bakeries and pies, and of course they're Jewish immigrant-owned German bakeries and all the great history here of pie shops and all that. You're making me hungry just thinking about it. So. You have a question?
So about as long as we're talking about chicken fried steak, you have to throw in Vickery Cafe.
Vickery Cafe is go ahead.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's good.
Vickery Cafe is in the 4200 block of West Vickery. It's another of our classic old Greasy Spoon diners, but it has a chef who bought it about 2 years ago, a former hotel chef who's significantly upgraded the menu and the food. It's not historic, but the attitude is, the mindset's definitely old-time diner, plate lunch cafe culture. And it was built I think that was built in the 70s as Birdave's Cafe when that strip shopping center was built. Don Felipe was next door, which is gone now. But of course, then I think of the dominant restaurant in that part was Polito's, which was built in the 60s. And Pedro Polito was another restaurant founder who came from Michoacan. It was when I talked to the Revolver Taco Lounge guys out here, and they're all in their 20s, and they're all, their families all from Michoacan, and they have their grandmothers and aunts back in the back. When you order something at Revolver Taco, then the grandmother and aunt team in the back gets busy, and they start making your corn tortilla then for your taco and things like that. So, but it's all handmade. And it's all handmade just the way that Jesusita did when Joe T started 80 years ago. Some of the flavors and sauces are the same. And I took Lanny the Third over there, and he said it was just remarkable how nothing had changed. And Pedro Polito is from Michoacan too. You mentioned West Vickery, and that made me think of the Politos. I'm sorry I got off your subject.
I'm a Carter Riverside girl of the 60s.
All right.
And we went, after football games, we would always go to Swanky Shack.
The Swanky Shack on Sylvania. Uh-huh.
And then the Griddle at 6 Points.
Yeah, I don't know who ran the Swanky Shack. I went there for plate lunches, and I know Doyle Willis used to eat lunch there a lot.
Our next door neighbor.
Okay, I'd see Doyle there a lot. I don't know the history of the Swanky Shack. Of course, the 6 Points Griddle was one of several in the griddle system, the Bo Yale's griddle system chain that all sprang up in the 50s and 60s, and I think there's still a griddle building on Lancaster, although it's something else now. And the M&O, if you go to the Leonard's Museum out at out here on Carroll off of White Settlement, it's the Leonard's Department Store Museum. The cafe in there has they don't call it griddle sauce, but they have hamburgers with a sauce that is, the griddle sauce was really simple. It was 1 part mustard, 1 part ketchup, and 1 part relish. And but they use hamburgers with griddle sauce. Now there was another Grump's in Granbury for years. This will be another old diner that everybody remembers. Grump's used to hand make Rocky sauce and have burgers with Rocky sauce like the Rockefeller hamburger diners had. And I'm so passionate about these old Rockefeller hamburger diners. They're these classic old metal diners that all of them are gone except Sonny's Grill on North Main is an old Rockefeller. But Rocky sauce is too complicated to make. It has like Worcestershire and anchovy or something. And it has like 11 different ingredients. And I think Grump's finally gave up on Rocky sauce. But you mentioned the griddle. And there's another, apparently there was another diner out there that the Billy's Oak Acres is moving into a place that is on Belknap that may have been built as a diner in the 20s or 30s. I'm trying to get some more history on that.
For A&W Brewers thing?
No, well, it's at, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get on the iPad and look it up and see exactly, but it was a carpet store for most of our lifetimes. So, but it apparently was built as a diner too. I love all these old diners. I love all these old restaurants, and I love writing about all the old and the new. I did not look up the first Chinese restaurant in Fort Worth. I can tell you that there were Chinese restaurateurs here in the teens and 20s as well, but the first Italian restaurants did not come until after World War II, when the soldiers of the 36th and 45th Divisions came back. They all came back here looking for work. And they had been in Italy, they'd been on Anzio, they'd been in Sicily, and they came back, they had all this great Italian food, and they came back and they wanted it. And so that's how, first of all, Campisi's in Dallas, the Campisi family that was bar owners started serving lasagna first and then started making this pie that everybody wanted called pizza. And so the Campisi family started selling pizzas, and then the over here the Margie's Italian Gardens family, Margie Walters and her family opened Margie's out on Highway 80 West, which is now Spur 580, and it's under different ownership now. But I believe that Margie's Italian Gardens and the old Italian Inn both opened within a month or two in 1952 or 3, and they were the first Italian restaurants in Fort Worth. I think we kind of track everything back to Campisi's now, and the Margie's does not have the same recipes it used to have. But the war, when men came back from the war and women too, they wanted to have some of the food they'd had around the world, and that's what has helped make, the first wave of immigration to the packing houses brought Fort Worth foods from around the world. But then once people from Fort Worth went around the world and came back, that's when they brought more food ideas, and they wanted more than chicken fried steak and steaks and barbecue. So that's how we came to be the great, I don't want to say Fort Worth's the great melting pot. It's not like we're Houston, the great port city or something, but we do have a good international food selection. Yes?
What about Drake's Cafeteria? When was the first African American?
I think Drake's was in the 20s or 30s in the down off of Jones and 9th there. I didn't come up with too many notes on that. Somebody else was telling me about that yesterday. He said don't leave out Drake's, but I think the Drake family founded that near Gooseneck's Bank over there before they moved to East Rosedale. I should know more about some of the other African American owned restaurants, some of the other founded businesses. And I know that there's been a couple that I've written about that go back a long way, but I'm sorry I don't remember the exact history on that. Of course, there have been great, everybody downtown would remember the Richelieu Grill, and everybody loved the chili at Richelieu Grill. It was legendary, and people talked about the Richelieu chili. Well, Theophilus James, who lived in Stop 6, was the chef who came up with the Richelieu chili recipe, and I don't know where he had cooked before, but he brought him and said, look, this is going to be the best chili, and it's going to have a little more pepper in it than everybody else's chili, and everybody's going to love it. The Richelieu started in the 40s down by the railroad station on Lower Lancaster. When the convention center was built, it was displaced and moved up on Main. And when that building was torn out, Theophilus had written out the recipe on the wall, on the sheetrock over the stove. He had written up the recipe up there so that everybody could follow it. He wasn't there. And he actually had them break out that chunk of plaster. And when they moved to the new location, he took the chunk of plaster with him to make the chili with. And I talked to him like 20 years ago. He passed away about 12 years ago. And after he passed away, after I saw it in the paper, I asked I knew the Richelieu had closed, and then Mr. James died, and I asked, do y'all still have the recipe? And his daughter said, no, we don't know whatever happened to that. But it's just such a heartbreaking loss, and I'm sorry I don't have a more well-rounded picture of history and restaurants, but I think that I sure do try to make the coverage in the Star-Telling Room very well-rounded. Yes.
Question. Was there a certain criteria or requirement, because in regard to restaurants, I come up with at least 3 different terms, cafe, greasy spoon, restaurants. I mean, how do you differentiate between what's a restaurant, what's a greasy spoon, what's a cafe?
There is no differentiation at all that I can think of. It's just whatever you want to use. The people at Vickery Cafe proudly call themselves one of the best greasy spoons, but a lot of people would be insulted if you called their place a greasy spoon. I think cafe, coffee shop, and restaurant and diner are all marketing names, and they're just whatever they choose to call themselves.
In the early part of the history, say like the early 1900s up to about the 40s or whatever, a lot of the cafes or restaurants sometimes had entertainment in them.
Well, a lot of the cafes and restaurants were in hotels, and they had restaurants, and they had entertainment and showrooms, and then the restaurants themselves.
I'm thinking kind of cafe, restaurant, dance hall kind of thing.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, I've just been talking about places mainly focused on food. You know, I could have gone back and talked about the White Elephant. The White Elephant was technically a bar and restaurant. But I think most of what went on there was gambling and drinking, and I don't know how much dining ever went on in the White Elephant. And you know, I should mention, I didn't talk about her because she's not in my restaurant history, but one of the most famous women in the history of Texas, one of the most famous African American women, as you all know, is Lucille Bishop, and the Lucille Bishop Smith, and the work she did. Lucille Bishop Smith was a pioneer of cooking recipes, and she taught when this new device, when gas stoves started coming out, she was one of the women hired to teach people how to cook on their gas stoves, but she wound up developing this whole history. She and U.S. Smith on Evans Avenue developed this whole barbecue and catering company, and they were famous, and to this day they're famous for those chili biscuits. And Lucille Bishop Smith's chili biscuits are still sold at Roy Pope's, I believe. And but it was, I mean, that when you talk about food on Evans Avenue, Lucille Bishop Smith and the chili biscuits are somebody that's known everywhere. There is to this day, just in the last few years, her great-grandchildren have opened a restaurant in Houston named Lucille's, and it's a contemporary version of Lucille Bishop's cooking. Lucille Bishop Smith is one of the most prominent African-American women in the history of Texas. She cooked for Lyndon Johnson. And that's and then we get back into food, and I completely forgot to mention somebody. Lyndon Johnson put 2 Fort Worth food people on the map. Lucille Bishop Smith by having chili biscuits in the White House and making chili biscuits the standard bread on Air Force One. And then the other Fort Worth person he made into a celebrity was Walter Jetton. And Walter Jetton is generally, Walter Jetton and Lyndon Johnson are regarded as the 2 Texans who made barbecue famous. Until the 30s, 40s, 50s, Life magazine, Time magazine, they didn't do stories about barbecue. When Amon Carter had guests out to the Shady Oak Ranch, he served them steaks. The barbecue was not considered the talk of Texas like it is today. But when Lyndon Johnson was elected and started digging pits in the White House lawn and having Walter Jetton come barbecue a whole side of beef, and then for all the international media, or he had people down to the ranch for barbecues, that's when the world started taking note of what is this barbecue and what is it all about. And, you know, some of us grew up with Jetton's Cafeteria that became Colonial Jetton's, but Walter Jetton's role, although he wasn't the first or the oldest barbecue restaurant, you know, his role in popularizing barbecue in the 60s is recognized in all the history books. And it was, when you look at famous pitmasters, Walter Jetton may have been the first famous pitmaster who was written about in New York and Paris and Los Angeles for his barbecue. He would take a side of beef, and it was cooked over coals, not in a closed pit. The restaurant today, if you said, where could I find something today like Walter Jetton's barbecue, would be Cooper's in the stockyards. Cooper's, you know, cooks over open fire. But Jetton's is regarded as you know, he didn't just put Fort Worth on the map, but Texas on the map. LBJ did a lot to make Fort Worth food famous. Anybody else have a question about food, or one more? Okay.
Do you know if the sauce recipe from the apple is survived?
You know, I think somebody claimed the other day that they have the recipe. I don't know. Terry Brown and his family had it, and I remember that one of the local restaurants claims that they have a sauce recipe that's very similar to the Big Apple sauce. And I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. I could search in my clippings. I know I've written about it. But you know, it is, you know, it was kind of a sweet sauce with just a little bit of cayenne, and it was more of a southern sauce than a Texas sauce. You know, we could get into arguing barbecue sauces. You know, they're different. Like Railhead has a thick sauce, Angelo's has more of a thin vinegary sauce, and you know, everybody has their opinion about sauce. Sammy's, you know, when Dan Jenkins was writing books about Fort Worth, if you go back in Dan's books, he talks about the big debate in Fort Worth over barbecue is who's better, Angelo's or Sammy's. Well, Sammy's on East Belknap has this really thin vinegary sauce, and you know, it hasn't been until the last 20 or 30 years we started having these thick sauces, except at the Big Apple. The Big Apple was known for having this more of southern sweet sauce, and somebody has it. I can't think who. Sure.
Do you cook?
Well, you know, when my wife and I met a few years ago, and the first time she came over, and I think I'd gone to work or something, and she was in my house alone for a couple hours, and she wanted to heat something up, and she was really surprised when she opened the oven and found out that I was using it to store leftover T-shirts and socks. So I don't cook, and I don't pretend to cook, but my knowledge of food kind of started with my father. My father went to the Army as a mess cook in World War II, and he took his mother's recipes from Oklahoma. And by the end of the war, people say, what did your daddy do in the war? My daddy baked pies. My daddy was the pastry chef for General Clark, you know, by the end of World War II. And he started out as a mess cook, and everybody, you know, started talking about how good his cooking was, and they kept moving him up, and the officers moved him up, said, get that Oklahoma guy, get him to come up and do my cooking. And he wound up baking for General Clark. So when you know, growing up every week, my father and I, one of the things that I remember most is that we went and did all the grocery shopping every week. He took me to the grocery store, and we went through the Safeway, and he very meticulously taught me about everything and how to pick pork chops and how to pick cucumbers and how to pick squash and which, you know, brand of canned goods he liked the best and everything. So we did all the grocery shopping, and then he brought it home like a lot of old-fashioned guys, I guess. He brought it home and said, okay, here it is, cook it. And you know, my mother did all the cooking. But my father would take charge on 2 occasions, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And on Thanksgiving, actually, my father and mother, they didn't agree on dressing. So we had turkey, but they each had dueling dressing. And we had both my mother's dressing and my father's dressing. One had a little more sausage and sage, and one was a little bit more cornbread. And so I had to have a little bit of both of their dressings. And of course he would bake pies, and the smell of baking pies just, you know, filled the whole house on Thanksgiving morning, and he would cook on Christmas too and do the Christmas cooking. Sometimes on Sunday nights, for Sunday night dinner, he would make, and this is an odd thing to have for dinner, but he would go in the kitchen and make pancakes and sausage, and we'd have that on Sunday nights. It's just an easy dinner. But so my father taught me to love food and taught me a little bit about food. And since then, I've just learned a lot from eating out all the time, and just from, and I've tried to read as much as I can and learn what other people think is good. And I think my taste is pretty good. And the other night I was with a group, and we were eating tamales at Lanny's, and these are all people who think they're pretty good food people. And we were having one of Lanny's expensive dinners at his restaurant on the west side, and they were talking about the tamales, and they were arguing. They said, "What's in these tamales?" Somebody said, "Well, this is pork," and they said, "No, I think this is lamb," and someone else said, "No, I think this is goat." I said, "Y'all, this is a game bird. This is either a pheasant or a duck tamal." And so the server comes over, they said, "What's in these tamales?" She said, "It's duck," So yeah. And actually, Pat Sharp and I have talked. Pat Sharp is the food editor of Texas Monthly, and she takes me along when she comes to restaurants here often, and she said that for somebody who doesn't cook, that obviously I wouldn't try to cook, but I can identify flavors, and we'll be at a sauce, and she'll say, "Is that tamarind?" and I'll usually have it right about what it is. So I don't know, I just inherited a lot or picked up a lot from my dad. But anyway, I don't mean to talk about myself. Is there anything else here about old Fort Worth restaurants or favorite old restaurants, diners? Yes?
Would you repeat the three parts of the griddle sauce again?
Just mustard, ketchup, and relish. Just mixed together, and you can go get it over at the M&O Grill right now for lunch and have it on a burger. So, yeah, I miss the griddle, and I miss the Rockefeller, and of course we still have one of the classic American diners. Historic architecture is right by the Modern there. It's now the Salsa Limon Taqueria, but when and I guess the reason I'm here is in partly because of the new exhibit at the Carter, which is the great American art of food, and it's a great food art. It's pictures of fruit baskets and turkeys and all this, but they also have the great Nighthawks painting of the people hanging out at the diner in Brooklyn. And so for DFW.com last week, we posed a photo in Salsa Limon that was very similar to the Nighthawks. Salsa Limon is a 47 chrome diner that was dropped in place there on University and was Topsy's Cafe for most of its history, and then became J&J's Oyster Bar. But it's one of the few rare original diners in this part of the country. I'm really fascinated with highway history and roadside Americana and the great old diners, motels, neon signs, and the fact that Fort Worth was the crossroads of the two great highways across North America, the Bankhead Highway, Highway 80 running east and west, and Highway 81, the Meridian Highway running from Winnipeg to South America, and the Lancaster and Maine as the crossroads of the two great highways across the continent. So and that's really fascinated with roadside America and highways and old diners and how all that fits together. The Godbys opened that back in the 50s. It's not part of the American graffiti kind of diner era, but it's the last of an old roadhouse. There were southern roadhouses, and there are still meat and threes in Mississippi and Alabama that are old, big sprawling homes that have a smorgasbord or a buffet. And Vance Godby's is our little piece of that southern tradition of the southern roadhouse. Zuiderzee was really well known. The Bill Martin Zuiderzee opened in the 50s, I believe, and Bill Martin's family opened it. The Zuiderzee was on 7th and Jokoski Center, where Michael's is now, and then opened several other locations. People remember the Zuiderzee for the catfish. The breading was, and I think it was a freshwater catfish. There was something about the catfish that was different from everybody else's. I can't remember it now. And then, of course, the stick hush puppies. They made stick hush puppies back before they were cheap frozen variety. And and Bill Martin's eventually expanded, had 5 or 6 locations in the 70s. And the Martin family every now and then tries to reopen and goes through some false start of reopening in Alvarado or the far side of Cleburne or somewhere, and then closes back down. But we wouldn't, if Bill Martin's open today, we wouldn't consider it a great seafood restaurant, but it was all we had back then, and people always love hush puppies. So, thank you all very, very much for all the thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I have no dessert.